Good evening, everyone. My name is Heidi White, and I am the Group Fitness and Wellness Manager at JCC Greater Boston. Special thanks to Beth Israel Deaconess Needham and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center for their partnership and for helping to coordinate the Wellness Speaker Series, including tonight's topic on Beyond the Scale, Unpacking the Obesity Puzzle with Judi Townsend. Judi is a practicing physician assistant in medical weight management at Beth Israel Lahey Medical Center. In 2007, she began working under the tutelage of Dr. Louis Aroni from the Comprehensive Weight Management Program at the Weill Cornell Medical Center in New York. Early in practice and prior to recognition by the American Medical Association, she readily supported the idea of obesity as a disease state, requiring integrative medical treatment and lifestyle management. She has co-authored with Dr. Aroni in the textbook, Understanding Obesity, Biological, Psychological, and Cultural Influences. She is also a practicing licensed marriage and family therapist with a focus on disordered eating and transgenerational family patterns. She is also certified in exercise physiology by the American College of Sports Medicine. And before I turn things over to Judi, I just want you to recognize that we're going to be using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen during the presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll also be using the Q&A feature. And with that, Judi, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Okay, and thank you, Heidi, and to the JCC for having me here to speak on what is a really timely and important topic. And I say that because by understanding, addressing obesity, we're really potentially addressing over 200 other weight-related complications that can accompany excess weight, especially when it's over time, weight is present over time. I think once you start to put together the pieces of the puzzle, it won't be all of them, certainly. I think what it will probably be very surprising to you that we ever, at any point in time, that we ever thought that weight was a matter of more calories taken in than expended, because that is such an incredibly simple thought, and it is just the disease process that we talked about you'll still understand even if you weren't there. And I'll repeat a few of the things that I said to make everything very clear. But you'll understand that it's an incredibly complex disease process. I'm hoping that, we believe at BI that knowledge is power. And I'm hoping that you leave the webinar feeling hopeful and empowered to affect the trajectory of your journey towards better health. That's my goal. Also, understanding why obesity is a disease is important because it's one of, I say, no option for disclosure. It's one of only a few common diseases taken every that every minute of every day there's, I would say, a HIPAA violation where anyone struggling with weight doesn't have an option about whether or not they want to disclose their condition. So for me, that makes it even more important to educate patients, family, friends, and even providers who really need to understand that this, again, is a disease process. And so people struggling don't have to feel the shame that they feel and experience the bias and discrimination that we all know happens each and every day. So I'm actually going to ask, I did this last time and I convinced a couple of people, if wondering, I want to see how many minds I change, and maybe you changed your mind back, I don't know, but how many people believe that obesity, weight is a result of a lack of willpower. And if you could put that in the chat, that would be great. And I'm not sure, Heidi, I think I'll see it. Maybe,
You have to
yes.
open up the chat to see it, but I can also
I'm
repeat.
trying, let's see. There we go. Okay. So webinar chat, nobody wants to answer. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to give it 10 more seconds. Okay, maybe nobody. All right, very good. So what is, oops, okay. Feast or famine. So as I said last week, that we are in 2025 running on outdated software. The software that was designed 3 million years ago and allowed us to go for long periods of time without food. We were able to store a lot of energy, and that would carry us through extended periods of time until we came upon, we had the opportunity to feast. And what's become problematic today is we live in an obesogenic environment. And many examples, I'll just give a few, is everything being having the opportunity to not have to leave your house to get food, to not have to walk in a grocery store, to walk into any season into a store or a home, and it's temperature controlled, so you don't shiver and you don't sweat. Not having to get up and change the channel on the TV, not running for the phone, just simple things, not even washing dishes. There's all kinds of things put together, results in a significantly diminished energy expenditure. So, and the body, the way it interprets weight loss, even now, is any loss of weight, any deviation from your highest weight is considered something dangerous. And it will do everything it can. Again, I said this last week, it will do everything it can to get you back to what it will defend. That's what we call it. It will defend your highest weight that you have held for any extended period of time. An extended period of time would be something more than a few months. If you went on vacation, you gained some weight and you lost it, changed your lifestyle when you got home and you lost the weight, that's not the kind of weight that your body is going to stubbornly hold on to. But when it sits for periods of time, your body starts to understand or interprets that as being a healthy weight. If we'll say John could have a fatty liver, he could have high cholesterol, he could have high blood pressure, a whole bunch of problems associated with weight. And if he's weighing something like 250 pounds and he drops to 200, the body interprets that as danger. And it will really, I'm going to talk about a very sophisticated way of getting a person to regain weight, to fight weight loss and bring weight back on. One of the long-term consequences along these lines is yo-yo dieting, or if you've ever in childhood struggled with anorexia. So each time the body loses, as you've noticed, typically without medication or being mindful, you will regain. Very often you regain even more. When you regain, you end up at a higher weight than you were when you first lost. Each time you yo-yo, the body interprets that as an episode of, again, from millions of years ago, an episode of famine. And it says to itself, oh, I recognize this. So the next time you lose weight, I know it's famine, and I will hold on even more tightly to the weight that you are at right now, because I understand that you are in an environment where there's feast or famine. And then if you lose weight again, you regain, and the body becomes even more insistent on it. It believes, it understands that this truly is a feast or famine environment, and it will even more tightly hold on to the weight and possibly even put on more weight in a way to protect you from what it believes to be an upcoming famine at some point. So again, there's nothing you need to know about this slide. This is just to give you a sense, as I did last time also, about just how complicated the weight regulating system is. It involves the nervous system, it involves the pancreas, the liver, the stomach, the whole GI tract, the brain. The hypothalamus in the brain is the part of the brain that's mostly involved, although there's many, many parts. So again, nothing you need to know about that, but that's not even all of it. That's a lot of it. So hunger and fullness. Hunger has a deep evolutionary motive. When we feel hungry, we feel uncomfortable, and that's the whole idea, to get you to want to get rid of that uncomfortable feeling. In way back when, to get rid of that uncomfortable feeling meant getting up out of your wherever you were sleeping and walking sometimes 15, 20, 30 miles with lots of tools on your back. You had to be really motivated to get out and try and find food. So again, hunger was made to be an uncomfortable feeling and a driver for seeking out something to eat. Hunger and fullness there are again many hormones, but the main ones that you might want to remember is ghrelin, leptin, and insulin. Ghrelin is a hunger hormone that comes from the GI tract. When you wake up in the morning, your ghrelin levels, depending on how you slept, and we'll talk about that, will start at different, different levels. And as the day goes on, your morning goes on, your ghrelin levels start to come up. And initially you feel a little bit hungry, and then they rise a little more, and you feel more hungry until you eat. Once you eat, ghrelin starts to come down and you feel full, and then it starts, say, maybe for the next meal, it starts to go up again, up and down throughout the day. Leptin is a satiety hormone, a fullness hormone, and it communicates with your brain and says that you have enough fat stored. This is the way it's supposed to work. It says to the brain, you know what, there's plenty here, we're good. No need to add more fat. That's really important, because way back when, again, it was important not to be, if you were too lean, you didn't have enough fat stored, you wouldn't be able to survive these long walks through the desert, I guess, not a desert. You wouldn't be able to survive these long walks to find food for your family. And but if you were too heavy, I was going to say, then you might actually become prey for other animals. So the body has a really very exquisitely orchestrated way of using the hormones with the brain, the GI tract, and the fat cells to regulate hunger and fullness. The part of the brain, again, that a lot of these hormones communicate with is the hypothalamus. The problem that we've gotten into as we're I would say since it's getting worse, but since the 70s, is when we have excess weight, there is inflammation. Inflammation is a wonderful thing short term. If you have an abscess in your mouth or you sprain your ankle and whatever it is, it's going to swell up. You're going to get all these wonderful things that your immune system puts out, and you're going to get an increase in blood supply that's going to bring all these helper bees to the site to help healing. And that's a wonderful thing. But when inflammation is long term, it it actually wreaks havoc on any kind of tissue where there's inflammation. And um, specific to obesity, what we believe is that there's inflammation, again, in many places, but the hypothalamus in particular. So if ghrelin is coming from the GI tract, leptin is coming from the fat cells. It's almost, if you were to cover your ears for a second while you're listening to this lecture, you'd hear some of what I'm saying, but you might miss some of it, and there would be not a very, you wouldn't be able to take instructions necessarily that I gave you and work with them. So when there is inflammation, you can see, this is just a little slide with showing you that leptin's tidy hormone, ghrelin is the hunger hormone coming from the gut and going to the brain. So again, you don't have to know anything about this slide, but we used to think that belly fat, that we call visceral fat, was just a very passive storage depot, but it turns out that it's an extremely active endocrine organ. And it has all these things going on, which would be some of them hard to pronounce, but and there's nothing good happening. And in fact, there's somewhere, I don't know if you can see my pointer, there's something up here that actually is good and that can help with keep cholesterol levels down and keep blood pressure down. But when you develop, the more visceral fat that you have, the less available that those adipokines are. So everything on that slide is bad except one good thing, one class of good proteins, and they go down. So you're really at a disadvantage as you develop more and more visceral fat. And of course, the longer that it's there, the more complications, the more opportunity these proteins and cytokines have to act on your immune system and your brain and all the things we were talking about. So this was in 2021, Gary Taubes he wrote a very interesting article, if you want to take a look at it, and he called it a fatally tragically flawed paradigm that that made so that we were not looking at obesity in a way that we needed to, which is what we're talking about tonight, and really left it to individuals to feel that, again, it was their fault and a matter of taking in too many calories and not expending enough. So this updated paradigm, a lot of people may find this is kind of a relief, that in a lot of cases, the thought is that it's not that overeating causes obesity, but that obesity causes overeating. And I know I hear in the clinic so often, patients will say that I often ask, do you know when you're full? And do you know when you're hungry? And a lot of times they will say, I'm always hungry. I don't know the feeling of fullness. So, and of course, we'll talk more about it, but the more hunger eventually becomes a response to excess weight, as I said, and not a cause. So that conventional wisdom on food, that if we become overweight by overeating, then if we can undereat and then we'll get lean. But of course, that's wrong. And we talked about why the body will not let that happen. I said again, I know on the slide before, I just want to emphasize it again about inflammation interfering with communication. So what we say now, and I will simplify it, is instead of a calorie in, calorie out model, we call it a carbohydrate insulin model. Some of you may, I'm guessing a lot of you have heard the term, at least, insulin resistance. And I'm just going to start with a basic science lesson so every cells have insulin receptors, and insulin is like a key, and it opens the receptor and lets these, you can see red squares of glucose into the cell. That's what's supposed to happen, and then it sits in the cell until you need it for energy. And so we ask, sometimes it doesn't get into the cell. And the question is, what's so bad about too much insulin or glucose in your bloodstream? So of course, we have to have some amount of glucose. It's a good thing because, again, we can store it for future energy use. But the body has a limited capacity in muscle and liver to store extra glucose. And we certainly the body somehow knows that the bloodstream is not a place for glucose to hang out but we do know that when it sits in the bloodstream, it damages blood vessels, it damages nerves, and that's why people with diabetes get neuropathy. That's why there's a high rate, a lot of people have cardiovascular disease, require stenting, have heart attacks, because it damages the blood vessels as well. What we know is a normal range of fasting glucose. This is what you would see on your labs that you get from your doctor. Fasting would be for at least 8 hours, and 70 to 100. The numbers have, from I think even 5 years ago, the numbers have gone down, or the range that's acceptable has gone down. And to have your glucose in that range is the equivalent of having about a teaspoon of sugar floating around in your bloodstream. The question then, so where there's glucose, there's insulin. And the big question is, does insulin help us or hurt us? And the answer is that it's both. In low to moderate levels, it's very helpful. It does what? It does this. It allows the receptor to open, or the door to the cell, and it lets glucose disappear so it's not floating around the bloodstream. When there's excess insulin, which happens, and I'll explain, when there's insulin resistance. Resistance is that lock and key is not opening. You put the key in and somehow you realize, I guess, you have the wrong key. So very little, if any, glucose is getting into the cell, and lo and behold, it's in the bloodstream. Well, the body is smart enough, goes into a little bit of a panic, and it says, I can't keep you here. My job is to store. So what insulin is able to do is it is able to create its own cells. And those cells are fat cells. And fat cells can hold a lot of glucose. And if they get to the point where they're full, insulin can freely make another fat cell and another fat cell. And there's no limit to the number of fat cells that insulin can make. I also mentioned at the last talk that insulin, when it's floating available in the bloodstream, it does communicate. That communication seems to be very clear, unlike the leptin and some other satiety hormones. Insulin's communication with the brain is very clear, and the message it gives the brain is, I want carbohydrates. And the wanting is the craving. So that's why when people say, I can't have just, or some people, I can't have just one cookie or one couple of chips, it's because it starts that they're likely very insulin resistant, and it starts this whole cycle where you have too much insulin and you're kind of off to the races. So this, if you can you see my cursor here? Well, I'll just tell you. So the red line that you're seeing,
Cursor.
you can?
Yeah.
Okay. So this red line is up and down. These high peaks and these low valleys are what happens to blood sugar when you eat a high sugar diet. Okay. The optimal range is where the kind of beige is. And when you eat a balanced diet, which again, we're not going to get into, that's an entirely a different lecture. But when you eat a balanced diet, you get these nice, the blood sugar doesn't drop too much, and it doesn't peak too much, and it stays in this optimal range. What happens when you eat a very sugary diet, you can see this blue curve here. So that's a glucose spike. And very shortly after that, you have an insulin spike, okay? And they both somewhat fall together until you eat, and right here might be where there's communication with the brain saying, feed me, but insulin eventually does come down and glucose comes down. But then I'm going to go back to that. I don't know if I can move that. Oops. Well, we'll go back here. What you can see here is how different they're macronutrients. There's carbohydrates. There's three: carbohydrates, protein, and fats. Okay, so carbohydrates really can't require a lot of insulin because there's also so much glucose. A lot of insulin has to be put out by the pancreas in order to store all that sugar. You see the blood glucose level. Oops, sorry. This blood, I'll just say on the left, the blood glucose level that's coming up is very high for carbohydrates, comes from foods that you can see on the top, in the top box: bananas, rice, bread. Some of them are healthy and complex carbohydrates, but they still do require insulin to store. There's glucose as a result, as in the bloodstream as a result of digesting those foods. Then there's protein. That's the blue curve. There is some insulin that is required because there are some carbohydrates in protein also. And then you look at fats and you see that there's barely any glucose there's barely any glucose that needs to be stored when you eat a fat. And so, of course, there's very little insulin that needs to be available to help store the glucose. Here you can see, well, the red is a blood sugar spike. Again, I'm just showing you very different graphs so you can just get a solid idea of what's happening in your bloodstream. And that's not a healthy rise of glucose over the course of 60 minutes. And then again, the green is what would be a healthy blood sugar. It's going to rise whatever you eat, again, protein, carbohydrates, or fats. We talked last time about that there's one way the order in which you eat your food can minimize the glucose from spiking, even if you were to eat a meal that is made up of all the same foods as you were planning to eat, or you used to eat. If you eat it in the order of your protein first, then or a protein and vegetable is ideal, then your fat, or that can even be eaten with it, and then carbohydrates at the end of the meal, you're much less likely to get that spike. So that spike again, if you go to a restaurant, you eat bread before the waiter comes and takes your order, you're already getting a spike of glucose. So when they take your order, chances are it's going to be bigger than it would have been if you had not had bread before you ordered. So in terms of insulin resistance, it's important for you guys I want you to want to help you understand. So again, resistance is, if you imagine the cells in your body, I don't know, with saran wrap around them, right? And the cell is not very easy to penetrate. So you go to McDonald's, you have a burger and you have a soda and you're digesting it. The pink here is your stomach, and behind the stomach is the pancreas. And the pancreas knows that glucose, here's some glucose, ooh, sorry, is being secreted. And the insulin again transports the glucose to the cell and it can't get in. So it'd be nice if the pancreas would sit back for a little and say, you know what, I'm going to give you a chance to try and get this glucose into the cell. And if you really need me, I will put out more. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. It gets kind of, I imagine the pancreas getting kind of panicky and it puts out more insulin. So more insulin is produced, the glucose level is still high in the blood. So as I told you before, the body says, okay, well, thank goodness there's fat cells and I can just store it there. Again, the fat that we're talking about is the visceral fat, the belly fat. And so we get all those obnoxious proteins, and we'll call them proteins, coming out of the fat cells, and there is inflammation. And when there's inflammation, once again, it's very cyclical. The brain is saying, I don't know if I'm hungry, I don't know if I'm full, but I think I'm hungry. And then it keeps going. So, whoops, I apologize. Wait. Okay, so what causes insulin resistance? Those frequent blood sugar spikes will, the more often you have them, the more likely and the sooner you will likely develop insulin resistance. As we age, there's some degree of insulin resistance. As we lose muscle, we become insulin resistant because muscle is very insulin sensitive and it always will be. Muscle, is very, very hospitable to glucose. It's always welcoming it in, which is one of the reasons, one of many, that exercise is so important. We talked about belly fat, having a family history of diabetes. So there is a genetic component. Again, we talked last time, genetics is not everything by any means, but it does increase your risk of diabetes and prediabetes. And yes, you could say that insulin resistance is a state of prediabetes. If you have a history of gestational diabetes, that puts you at risk for insulin resistance. What we say is that if you have gestational diabetes, or we say pregnancy is a stress test for your pancreas. And if you develop gestational diabetes, you've pretty much failed that stress test. And your risk of becoming diabetic is significantly higher. So in terms of history, it could also be that maybe you didn't have gestational diabetes, but you were born to a mom who had gestational diabetes or had an elevated blood sugar. If that was the case, what happens is that insulin glucose can cross the placenta. So a baby's glucose in utero can be elevated just like mom's. The problem is that mom's insulin can't cross the placenta, so baby has to produce its own insulin. And of course, bathing in utero in a whole lot of insulin is going to do to potentially, I'll say potentially, but often does, set up somebody for a higher risk of diabetes later in life, and of course, insulin resistance. Sleep apnea is a considerable risk for insulin resistance. We know that when you get into REM sleep, that is where your hunger hormones and insulin it takes a rest. It's time. It's the time when your brain does a lot of cleansing, I would say, and you get, yes, a nice dip in a lot of in the hunger hormones and in insulin. Sedentary lifestyle, of course, that's, not something new to anybody. There's hormonal disorders like polycystic ovarian syndrome that can cause insulin. It essentially is a state of insulin resistance. Hormonal changes like menopause can certainly very often bring on insulin resistance or worsen it. There's also over-the-counter medications like antihistamines, not the Claridins, but the older ones, and maybe the Advil PMs or any of those kinds of medications that people use sometimes to help them sleep have some of the older antihistamines in them, and they can it's one of the factors that can lead to insulin resistance. Also, prescription medications. There's unfortunately a lot of psychotropic medications that are really helpful. Only a few of the, I would say, SSRIs and SNRIs, but a lot of the medications that are used for bipolar disorder and schizophrenia can certainly create a state of insulin resistance. So the question, does it lead to diabetes? So here on the left, you can see is a normal pancreas, and the green is the insulin. And you can see on the bottom, I'm a little afraid to move the cursor, the green bubble hooks up with the little blue bubbles of glucose. And eventually you can see on the bottom that peach colored mass is tissue, and it's going to move the glucose into the cells. And that's all well and good. And then your glucose level goes down to hopefully 70 to 100 or up to 140 if you've just eaten, and life is good. Over time, you have to think about if you're insulin resistant and the pancreas is always, oh my gosh, there's still glucose, and it puts out more insulin, more insulin, more insulin. Eventually, the cells, there's many different kinds of cells in the pancreas that I won't confuse you with, but there are beta cells in the pancreas. Those are the ones that put out insulin. And if it keeps going like that especially if you become overweight at a young age, eventually it just says, I'm tired and I just can't do this anymore. And eventually you are still a type 2 diabetic, but you can be a type 2 insulin dependent diabetic. It used to be when I was in school, it was if you took insulin, you were a type 1, and if you didn't, you were a type 2. But you can be a type 2, meaning your pancreas was not destroyed by a virus, or that's usually what it is. But it just kind of pooped out from overwork. Eventually, you will need insulin, hopefully not because of the new medications, but for a long time, you needed insulin from a bottle. Okay. We do know that, so if you know a diabetic that struggles with weight, chances, and they're using insulin from a bottle, as opposed to a glucose monitor, that you wear a patch and it's a constant glucose monitoring. When you give yourself glucose from a bottle, it's kind of a guesstimate. I think you need this many units, and then you check your blood sugar, and you may have given yourself too much, or the doctor gave you a prescription for too much, and then the next time you look through your recorded glucose levels, then you decide whether or not to change the medication. So it, again, whether it's from a bottle or from your own pancreas, too much insulin is not a good thing. It's kind of like Goldilocks. There's just the right amount of insulin. So yeah, and you can see that then there's leftover glucose in the blood. That's damaging to the vessels, to the nerves, and we've talked about that. What can you expect from short and long-term, in terms of short and long-term weight loss? What we see is that you can expect, on average, a 5% weight loss with diet and exercise alone. That seems to be the maximum. With the current weight loss medications, we're seeing anywhere from 10 to 22%. What they're hoping for is in the future, and it's not really that far away, possibly 24 to 30% weight loss. And what is up and coming, it looks like, is it will not only help you lose weight, but it will spare muscle, because right now, the weight loss medications, the GLPs, it doesn't discriminate between or differentiate between fat and muscle. And of course, I always take a chance to give a plug for exercise again. That's why it's so important to, if you're whatever weight loss program you're on, to keep strength training in your program, because I'm sure I said it last time, muscle is like the furnace in your body. And if you lose weight, you get rid of the furnace, and for some reason you have to go off the medication, or your insurance company changes their mind at a whim, which does happen, you're not going to have a furnace that's going to help you keep the weight off. And that can be, it's kind of a recipe for weight regain and then some, and getting you back to, as I talked about, from millions of years ago. It can make your body say, oh, I'm not going to let this happen again. I get it. You were in a horrible famine, and I'm going to give you some extra weight, in fact, so that the next time you experience this, you won't get to a point where you're near famine. With surgery, it's at 30%, and again, looks like we will get there with the medications that are coming up in the future. Can weight loss be sustained long-term? I stress to every patient over and over and over, I spend a lot of time talking about this, that if you don't make lifestyle changes, let me put it in a positive way, if you make lifestyle changes, there's a very good chance that you will be able to sustain weight loss. But if you don't, the odds are very, very low. I prefer to say, I don't like to ever use the word dieting, or even, an exercise program, because it's something that we know the data there's more and more data showing that this needs to be integrated into your lifestyle, however that can be done. And I know there's a lot of people have jobs that keep them for long hours, and families and kids going everywhere, but it's something that you can't lose sight of. We know that even a 10% loss can have significant positive effects on your health. So If that's a wonderful amount of wherever you're starting, 10% is going to really benefit you. What are obstacles to maintaining weight loss? I think of weight loss kind of like driving, that you have to be vigilant all the time. And likely people who are older, not old, but getting older after the age of about 45, if they're still lean, chances are that they are pretty vigilant, that they're always aware of what they're eating and if they're exercising. An obstacle could be sabotage by others. There was an article in the Times that some relationships are breaking up over these GLPs because somebody's getting lean and has no patience for the person who's not taking care of themselves, or one partner likes the other partner being overweight. They like that's the person they married, that's what they want. There are also some people that aren't ready for that journey, and patients often share stories that somebody will know that they are on this journey and they will come into their house with food that they would never consider eating. And is it sabotaged by others? Sometimes, because just like if somebody's not drinking, if somebody has a drinking problem and they go to the person's house they used to drink with and they say, no, I'm good, it can make them very uncomfortable and aware of the journey that they're not on. There's self-sabotage. There's sometimes some people have expressed fear, if they lose, that's great, but if they regain, then they will be seen as a failure. Some people have said their worries are that they'll get to work or wherever it is that they go, and suddenly they'll be treated differently. And then it really affirms that they were treated one way because of their weight. And that is a really traumatic thing for people to experience. Suddenly you're nice to me, I've lost weight, and now you want to invite me to happy hour. And that's a really tough thing. Also, for some people, it's finally being seen, and some people want to be seen, and some people, there was a great deal of comfort in sitting with in a body with excess weight and not being seen. Emotional eating, I'm going to talk about mindless eating. I will also talk about, just briefly, old messages, like what did we grow up with? Who spoke? What was, what was whispered about somebody who was overweight? What I had actually one patient, the mom grew up overweight and it caused a lot of heartache for her. And she actually had a scale outside on the front porch stoop, and she would weigh her every time before she went in the house every day when she got home from school. There's also, I have a patient whose parent took her down to the track every day and insisted that she run around the track until she could come home for dinner. And there's also more subtle messages that people get when they're young, which is a very crucial time, of course, to develop your ideas about body image. Then there's also old message about the currency of food. Sometimes patients will say, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She spent all day slaving away in the kitchen. And if I got home and I wasn't hungry, everybody was upset with me if I didn't eat, or if I ate one portion. And that made my mom so happy, and I wanted her to be happy. So if I ate the second portion, that made her even happier. And so there's a lot of messages that go with food. There's a lot of clean your plate club messages. I have patients, one patient grew up in a very large family, and it was a matter of whoever got the food first. And so you ate quickly. You didn't really even think about if you were hungry or what you wanted. You just put a lot of food on your plate. Another is that in some families, they would eat because I think this happens a lot and still does, is it's 12 o'clock, it's lunchtime, it's 6:30, it's dinner time. And the problem with that is, first of all, if you're eating when you're not, there's no hunger, you probably don't need the fuel. And the other issue is you have a lot. I also ask patients, as I said, well, that's one of the reasons I ask if they know when they're hungry. One is, again, I'm sorry, I meant to say, I ask them if they ever feel full, and the other one is I ask if they know the sensation of hunger. And a lot of people don't. They're never, it's just not in their vocabulary. Um, Emotional eating, it's kind of obvious. It's maybe not. It's to self-soothe. It's to lessen or avoid uncomfortable feelings, to numb out. It could to elevate mood, and it can be even to prolong. You're feeling great, and let's go celebrate, and we'll have something to eat, and there's more good feelings. And so it doesn't even have to be a negative emotion. Some people, we call it over-the-counter medicine. And what is the antidote for that? Of course, mindfulness, that I'm going to talk about. So there's all these emotions. There's 8 core emotions, and I'm sure these you're familiar with, but the one that surprised me when I learned, this was about a year and a half ago, is that boredom. I did not know that boredom was an emotion. And in actuality, boredom can be incredibly useful. You might remember, I don't know, I can't see anybody, so I don't know your ages, but I know when we were kids, we got so bored that we'd use a banana as a phone. We'd put on plays. We did all kinds of things. Because it was so boring that it got us doing, to think about interesting things or make meaning of something boring that we had to do. Today, there's a lot of discomfort with, well, first of all, we don't really have an opportunity to get bored because of our smartphones. What we know is that more than 40% of people eat when they're bored. Boredom is linked to anxiety, depression, impulsivity, risk-taking. Chronic boredom is when often a person will perceive themselves as being trapped, that they have obviously no options to get away from what they're doing. People who struggle with, there are people who will feel, 2 people could have the same task, and one person is bored and the other one isn't, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with intelligence. It could just be that one person has a lower baseline dopamine level. And I'm going to tell you more. Let me just check the time. Oh, I'm running out of time. Okay, so sugary foods can increase the dopamine level. And a lot of people have a lot of discomfort when they're bored. They feel like they're not being productive. We were brought up in a society that you have to do. And a very interesting statistic is that they've done many studies over and over, and 3/4 of people would prefer an electrical shock over the task of sitting with their thoughts or daydreaming. I thought that was very powerful. Again, food can prevent movement towards finding meaning in a boring task. The difference between emotional hunger and physical hunger, you can see, occurs suddenly, a thought you can't get out of your head. Oh my, I switched that. Okay, so physical hunger is really, I apologize, a physical feeling, your stomach is growling. The emotional is the thought you can't get out of your head. If it's physical hunger. If somebody offers you broccoli, you'll probably take it if you're really hungry. If it's emotional eating, that's nothing, you won't even consider it. And physical hunger, you feel satisfied. Oh, I really did switch this. You feel satisfied once your stomach is full. Emotional eating, you feel satisfied after you feel uncomfortably full. What we can do is, I don't think I have time to go over this. Mindfulness is conscious thought. If I do have a minute, I want to go back to this slide. It's important to make the unconscious conscious. Dopamine gives us, it's a pleasure neurotransmitter. It signals the pleasure center in the brain. The problem is when we eat a lot of sweet food over and over and over, eventually there are receptors that say, oh, there's the dopamine coming in, pleasure, pleasure, and it fires. If you keep having a lot of sweet foods, eventually those receptors start to they do what those beta cells in the pancreas do, and they kind of shrivel up, and you need more and more sweet and high carb foods to hit that pleasure center. Even, oh, this is the red is the normal brain. That's where dopamine is. The other two, sugar users and cocaine, that's where you really don't really have any dopamine that's going to, it's just depleted. That's the hypothalamus. There's a bliss point. I talked about that last time. That's where when you eat something that's sugary, fatty, and salty, you hit a bliss point, and that's a very hard thing to turn away from. I talked about the reward center in the brain. These circuits get stronger and stronger, but you can rewire those circuits. That feeling that you can't live without carbs, this is so important, will change over time. Other foods will bring you pleasure and satiety. Changing what you eat does change your physiology. And eventually your bodies will turn to burning fat for fuel, and you'll find sweets easier to resist because your insulin levels will be lower. I want you to not look at the number on the scale. I want you to think about what weight loss means to you. What is it about your health? I won't be diabetic maybe I won't be diabetic like my dad. Maybe I won't have to have my knees replaced. It might be function. I can get down on the ground with my grandkids. I will be alive for my family, for my friends, and the next time when you look at a piece of cake and you're thinking, I want that, that's part of the mindfulness. You're saying, I want that, but it's not really the number on the scale. What I really want is to be at my grandkids' party. And so I say the scale's important to track where you're going, but it's really important to focus on why you're losing weight. It's not just to reach a number on the scale. Mindless eating, we eat unconsciously to actually achieve a state of unconsciousness. Can become a habit, and we have to be aware. It's very interesting, the hidden influences. I wish I had time to talk about that, but just acknowledging that you're eating mindlessly, that sitting in front of the TV and you're eating mindlessly is a first step. And the next time you sit in front of the TV, there'll be an awareness. And my goal for you is that you watch TV, and then even if you're going to eat the same thing, go in another room and really savor what you're eating, taste it, think about it, smell it, and appreciate the experience of eating it. There's ultra processed food. We know that 73% of the US food supply is processed. It is engineered to make you want food in the absence of hunger. We say it's not just something that's hard to resist, it actually is addictive. And highly palatable food, that kind of fatty, sugary, salty, can increase portion intake by 40% more than foods that are more neutral. If you look at, we say, if like in an M&M package, if there's 10 different colors versus 7 colors, you're going to eat 10% more M&Ms if there's 10, because we like variety. If there's 3 flavors of yogurt, you're going to eat 23% more than if there's a single flavor of yogurt. It also ruins your microbiome. We talked about that last time. You're going to absorb more calories with an unhealthy microbiome. This is my last slide.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes. So the question is, is it insulin or dopamine? How do they play into this new paradigm? We're still learning. Is it the chicken or the egg? It's really hard to say, but we do it. That's why one of the reasons that obesity medicine is so complicated, because there's every part of the body, every system, and as well as your environment and your genetics and your nutrition and your lifestyle. And you can't leave anything out of this disease concept. And that was fast. I apologize for making the second half so fast, but if there's any
Great
questions,
information. Yeah, so you can use the Q&A feature if anyone has any questions. Feel free to type them. You shared a lot of information. Any questions? You might have provided all the answers.
I told you everything you needed to know.
Great. Well, we are going to be posting this recording on the JCC Greater Boston website. And in closing, Judi, I just want to thank you so much. And special thanks to Beth Israel Deaconess Needham and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center for sharing this important information on obesity and the psychology of weight loss and management. Again, if you would like to hear this presentation again, or if you know someone who might benefit, we will be posting the recording on the JCC Greater Boston website on the Wellness Speaker Series page. And if you have any questions about JCC Greater Boston's programs, you are welcome to reach out to me. My email is hwhite@jccgb.org. And thank you so much. Have a great evening.
And thank you for joining.